The railways in Norfolk, like many parts of the country, are now a shadow of their former selves, hugely affected by the growing popularity and affordability of cars in the mid-20th century, losing two-thirds of its stations from 1959 to 1970, now leaving only 30 working stations in the county, where at one time the city of Norwich alone had 4. The height of the popularity of the railways was undoubtedly the Victorian and Edwardian period, as anyone who has seen Great British or Continental Railway journeys with Michael Portillo can attest. They were the beating heart of the country, transporting commerce and taking people to work and for days out. But not all journeys were without incident, as you will hear today. It was Thursday, 10th of September 1874. The weather was terrible. A heavy storm was hitting the area, and, in a situation far from unheard of in history, a train was delayed. In fact, 2 trains were. One, the express train from London, expected to arrive at what was then Thorpe railway station, now simply Norwich station, at 8:59 p.m, for passengers to change trains for their onward journey to Great Yarmouth, that in turn was meant to leave at 10 minutes past 9. But it was now 17 minutes past, and the London train was still to even arrive. The delay had been noted by Alfred Cooper, the night duty inspector of the station, who had arrived around 9 p.m, and, as you can imagine, was far from happy about the situation. The London Express was fast becoming known for its late arrival into Norwich. So, like anyone, he took his complaints higher, to the station master William Sproul, trying to convince him the best course of action now would be, with the train from London still running late, to bring up a secondary train waiting further down the tracks at Great Yarmouth, who had also now fallen behind schedule and had important cargo that needed to be in Norwich urgently. After the short conversation, Sproul would say the words that would start off this whole terrible miscommunication. "All right, we'll get her off." Cooper believed he had got through to his boss, and they would now make the express wait and bring up the second train from Yarmouth, while Sproul was under the impression they were going to make that wait until the express had passed through. Further down the line in question, the second train, the train that carried the mail and post daily into the city, engine number 54, had left the port town of Great Yarmouth at 8:45, bound for Norwich, before it stopped at Reedham, where it took on more carriages, this time carrying passengers that had come up from the Suffolk town of Lowestoft. It was driven by John Pryor, a 49-year-old with years of experience at the job, and assisted by his fireman, 25-year-old James Light. There would be little to indicate that this run would be anything else than the one he had made countless times before. Fully loaded with their cargo and passengers, they pulled out of Reedham, along the double tracks to Brundall, where it dropped back to single-line track, and where they waited for a head to be clear before they could make their way to Norwich. With Station Master Sproul's words ringing in his ears, Alfred Cooper went off to do what he thought he had been asked. Sent a message to the train sitting at Brundall, when in reality the request was to get the express moving. Cooper made his way to the station's telegraph box that was manned by 18-year-old John Robson, instructing him to send a message to Brundall to get the train moving. Dutifully, young Robson sprung into action. "Send the mail train up before the 9:10 p.m. down passenger train leaves Norwich. A. Cooper." Now, of course, Cooper had yet to sign off the instruction, as he was required to do by both the rules of the station and the law. But Cooper had often had messages sent out in this manner, only to officially sign them later to save time. It was 9:26, and as young Robson tapped away on the telegraph, he was unknowingly spelling the doom of many. The message was picked up by Brundall's station master, William Platford, who was assisted by his 12-year-old son, neither of whom wasted any time carrying out the instructions, and just 2 minutes after the telegram had arrived, the mail train had left the station. Unknown to them, the train from London had finally arrived, and the passengers who needed boarded the connecting train to Great Yarmouth that was now pulling out of Thorpe station. The express train had been given the go-ahead by Station Master Sproul himself, who, unaware that his instructions had been misinterpreted, must have thought Cooper was simply dragging his feet to prove a point. From his office, Cooper heard and saw the train leaving, but caught up with his work and the routine of his job, it took a couple of moments for him to fully understand what he was seeing. The realization must have struck him like a thunderbolt. He was reported to have come rushing from his office, yelling, "What about mail?" Storming towards the telegraph office and yelling at Robson, "Have you ordered up the Brundall train?" When Robson replied that he had, Cooper ordered him to send an immediate message to cancel the train. Robson fiercely hammered away at his message, while Alfred Cooper stood there, looking on, described as a man seemingly paralysed. They soon got their answer, and not the one they were hoping for. 2 simple words: mail gone. Cooper instantly flew into a rage at Robson, demanding to know why he had sent the message without it being signed by him. The clerk defended himself the best he could, claiming he had been told to send the message and about their previous arrangements with signings, but it was his word against a senior man like Cooper's. We may never know if there had just been another legitimate misunderstanding between these two, or if Cooper was simply trying to save his own skin that night. But within the railway industry, blame would follow Robson for decades. The two trains were now steaming towards each other, with no way of being warned. Panic set in around the station. People rushed to and fro, trying to think of anything they could do, all while Alfred Cooper stood, frozen to the spot in fear. Out on the tracks, the London Express, driven by Thomas Clark, and assisted by his fireman, Frederick Sewell, were eager to make up for the time they had lost sitting around the station, and, believing that the mail train from Yarmouth was waiting for them, they opened up the engine, increasing their speed to around 25 miles an hour. An idea that had also entered the mind of John Pryor on the mail train, who, in turn, thinking the express train was still at the station, did exactly the same thing. Two trains, carrying all manner of cargo, including a mule and a ton of fish, as well as 220 people, were now moments from disaster. It's not believed that either of the drivers saw each other coming before it was far too late. The darkness and the stormy weather obscured the columns of steam coming from the trains, and a slight bend in the track made it impossible to see each other until there was nothing that could be done. At 9:45 p.m, in heavy rain and darkness, the two trains collided headfirst into each other,
just east of the bridge across the River Yare,
near at what the time was Thorpe Gardens public house, but today goes by the name the Rush Cutters. The sound of the collision rumbled through the night like a thunderclap, sending locals, despite the weather, rushing out to find out what was going on. Those who went to thoroughly investigate were soon met by a scene of sheer carnage. The engines reared up into an almost perpendicular position, and the carriages mounted one on top of the other, and gradually sunk down into an altogether inconceivable mass of rubbish and ruins. Carriages were piled one on top of the other. Others had been thrown on their sides and had rolled some dozen yards away from the line. The trains had hit each other with a combined speed of around 60 miles an hour. With such force, the locomotives were now little more than twisted metal, leaking scalding hot water and steam. The express had been lifted from the tracks and crashed down sideways on the locomotive of the mail train. Thomas Clark, Frederick Sewell, John Pryor and James Light had all been killed instantly, as had the mule. The carriages immediately behind them were reduced to splinters, and others were forced upwards by the impact, and were now stacked on top of each other, some 20 to 30 feet in the air. The crash had also knocked out all the lighting in both trains, leaving trapped and injured people in total darkness. The aftermath was described as a ghastly pyramid formed of hissing locomotives, shattered carriages, and moaning, in some cases dying, passengers. The first doctor on the scene was Dr. Peter Eade. In fact, he had been a passenger in the first train carriage coming from Lowestoft that had been attached to the mail train at the time of the crash. Like many others, he had been thrown from the carriage like a rag doll. Despite his own injuries, he was badly cut across the face and hands. He immediately set to work, helping other survivors however he could. He later said of the crash, "Immediately upon the shock, I felt that my carriage had come to a sudden standstill. Then the compartment in which I was sitting seemed to diminish itself in its dimensions. At the same time, the carriage turned sideways. Then I knew no more until I picked myself up off the wet grass of a meadow into which I suppose I had been thrown. I collected myself together and was able to appreciate at once that the night was dark and the rain was falling fast, and that steam was roaring from a funnel of an engine which was standing in dangerous proximity to my person, who would work throughout the night, using bits of wood from the carriages as splints on broken legs and arms, only once having his own wounds looked at. Not all the carriages had been destroyed or damaged. In the collision, 6 being pulled by the express had simply come to a stop. Unfortunately for those on board, this had happened on the narrow wooden rail bridge that crossed the river. The bridge itself was a single-line track, meaning that the passengers inside were now effectively trapped. Their screams and calls for help soon attracted the attention of one of the train's guards, a man named Black, who came to their aid, creeping and trying to balance his way along the narrow supports of the bridge, carrying a lantern, and trying his best to calm the carriage's terrified occupants. While Black did this, another one of the guards, who went by the name Reed, began the journey back to Norwich on foot to try and raise the alarm. Little did he know that Thorpe Station was already fully aware of what had happened and were beginning to muster help from all over the city. A special train was being loaded, filled with men and equipment to cut people free. Doctors were being brought to the station by cabs from across the city and sent down the line to where they were needed, including one, Dr. Beverley, who, had he not cancelled his plans in Lowestoft that day, would have been a victim of the crash himself. Despite the huge amounts of men and equipment, the rescue was not going to be easy. There were many dead and injured of all kinds littering the area that, until reinforcements arrived, were being treated solely by Dr. Eade. Many were still trapped in the ruin of the trains, and of course they were working in virtual darkness. But regardless, they set to work. Wood was taken from the destroyed carriages and piled into huge piles next to the track. They were set alight to provide some light to work by. Able-bodied men were also being summoned from the local houses to come and help and move debris to help save those trapped. Among them was a Norwich dentist, Richard White, who would be pinned under a carriage for 4 hours. Unable to get to him, doctors ended up using a brandy-soaked rag on a stick for him to suck on as a makeshift painkiller. The injured were gathered up and soon found themselves being transported to the Norfolk and Norwich hospital, who were soon struggling to cope with the influx of so many injured people, including one woman who had to have her leg amputated at the crash site and another who was described as not having a single unbroken bone in her body. The initial body count stood at 15. Those who had lost their lives were initially taken to nearby boat sheds and pubs. The clear-up team began work later in the night, finding 3 more bodies, but rather quickly began to remove the wreckage from the track, and discovering, other than 2 bent tracks, the railway itself was undamaged, and by 2:30 the next afternoon it was open for business again. The crash had been terrible, but it could have been far worse. Had the trains met just 100 yards closer to Norwich, it would have been on the wooden rail bridge, and who knows how many carriages and trapped passengers would have ended up in the river. Or had both trains not been pulling cargo carriages mostly behind the engines that took the full impact of the crash, saving the passenger carriages from taking the full force. The heavy rain has also been credited for preventing both trains from going up in flames when the contents of the coal bunkers were thrown across the tracks and the carriages. Over the next 2 weeks, the disaster sprang up in newspapers all over the country, telling the tale of the crash and the hospitals in rather grim detail, such as: in the corner lay the corpses of a man, a woman, and a pretty little child, not much more than 4 or 5 years old. On the opposite side, the mortal remains of a woman, who appeared to be nothing but a chaotic mess of clothing, and between the bodies lay the wounded, and the smile that continually overspread the features of a poor young woman as she looked up into the face of her nurse was a thing never to be forgotten. She seemed to be dying. The final death toll stood at 27 dead and around 70 injured. The dead had come from all backgrounds and walks of life. Even whole families had been killed side by side or injured. Among the dead was John Betts, himself a stoker on the railways when at work. He had been killed alongside his wife and their 6-week-old son, who had yet to be named. Charles, their 3-year-old, had lived but suffered head injuries. London-based auctioneer Stanley Sald, Dr. Brasbury Francis, a local scientist who specialised in botany, had both lost their lives. Even the local regiment had been affected. Sergeant Major Frederick Castle and Sergeant Robert Ward of the West Norfolk Militia had taken advantage of a spot of leave they had been given and gone fishing on the Norfolk Broads. Both men lost their lives that night and were buried with full military honours. Much like when we talked about the collapse of the Great Yarmouth Suspension Bridge, as well as in all disasters, there was no end of lucky escapes. One young couple had left one of the first carriages of the express to move to a quieter one minutes before the collision. A young woman had been thrown clear of the crash, landing mostly unharmed in a nearby garden. There is also the story of a 4-year-old girl who was saved when she landed in a pile of fish being brought up from Great Yarmouth. The most unbelievable but true story is that of the mail guard, who, as his title suggests, was in charge of looking after the post coming from Great Yarmouth. The mail carriage was completely destroyed, and he was injured, but rather than seeking medical attention, he simply gathered up all the post and the parcels he could find, loaded them into a handcart, and took them to Norwich to get them to the post office, before taking a horse and carriage back home to Great Yarmouth. 2 investigations into the collision began almost immediately, and it wasn't long until both Alfred Cooper and John Robson were arrested. The following coroner's inquest found both men guilty of gross negligence and carelessness, bordering on manslaughter, but put much of the blame on Cooper due to his seniority, while a separate investigation by the Board of Trade found Robson the far more guilty party due to him sending the unsigned message against Cooper's apparent wishes. Inquests were one thing, but both men soon faced criminal trial in the April of 1875. There was no united front between the two men. Each did his best to put all the blame on the other while removing it firmly from his own shoulders. When the final verdict was decided, John Robson was acquitted of all charges, while Alfred Cooper was sentenced to 8 months in prison with hard labour. The Great Eastern Railway Company, who controlled the trains in the area at the time, ended up paying £40,000 in compensation to the victims and their families, around £4 million today, and a virtually unheard-of compensation sum at the time. Those killed in the tragedy can be found buried in many places, including Rosary Cemetery in Norwich, where John Pryor and James Light are buried side by side. The funeral of Thomas Clark, held in a small chapel near the same rail line he used to work on, was unfortunately interrupted by the passing of the express train, sending his widow into hysterics and bringing a sad end to already sad proceedings. The Thorpe railway disaster was one of the worst rail crashes in Victorian Britain, and along with others, including another head-to-head crash 2 years later on the Somerset and Dorset railway line, became a driving force to increase communication and safety on the rail networks. The crash was the direct inspiration for engineer Thomas Tyre to create the Tyre Electric Train Tablet System, a system that would mean without a physical token, a train would not be allowed to use a single line of track. Despite the impact it had on the state of rail travel at the time, the Thorpe railway disaster is now largely forgotten. Even locally, it is not a widely known event. The crash is commemorated by a small plaque near the crash site, and was documented in the book, The Great Thorpe Railway Disaster, 1874, Heroes, Victims, Survivors, a book that I am certainly going to pick up when I can, as well as it being mentioned in passages in other books, as you have seen here. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was the Thorpe Railway Disaster, and this was a little bit of history.